So, the film that I have decided to focus on for this presentation and for our final paper in this course is the Free State of Jones. And it's going to be the object of this presentation for me to explain how accurately this movie does or does not depict the Civil War. So, for some background context, Free State of Jones is based on the real story of Newton, aka Newt Knight. He was a farmer from Mississippi who served in the Confederate Army as a field medic. He didn't fully align himself with the ideals of the Confederacy, so rather than actively fight, he was just kind of like running along the battlefield, picking people up, taking them to the medical tents, and trying to save as many lives as possible. But he leaves the service after his young nephew is killed in battle. It kind of opens his eyes to the true atrocities of war, and it's just kind of the final nail in the coffin for him to leave the service. And after all this, the film proceeds to follow the events of the Jones County Rebellion, which occurred in October of 1863. So, the plot of the movie is that Newt Knight ends up being labeled as a deserter of the Confederate Army after he leaves the service to bury his aforementioned nephew back in their home of Jones County. He is told from some of his fellow soldiers, like, hey, if you leave, like, you have to be serious about this because the law is going to come after you, and if they catch you, you're going to be put in jail or killed. But Newt disregards them and does this anyways. So now, as a fugitive, he ends up hiding out in the swamp of Mississippi and joins forces with a group of runaway slaves. And eventually, as he's opposed to slavery and just overall tired of the ongoing war, Newt decides to join with the runaway slaves and other farmers in Mississippi who have their own reasons for wanting to rebel against the Confederacy. And thus, he leads the Jones County Rebellion. There is a side plot happening throughout the movie alongside this main story, and it follows the story of one of Knight's descendants, Davis Knight, and it touches on the racism that he faced decades after the Jones County Rebellion in the 20th century. Davis Knight was tried in 1948 for the crime of miscegenation after marrying a white woman. There were claims that since he was the descendant of Knight and his second wife, who was a free woman named Rachel, that he was breaking segregation laws since he wasn't fully white and was married to a white woman. So there's about 3 or 4 scenes throughout the movie that kind of flash forward in time to this trial. And it's to really show viewers that this racism and these problems that Newt Knight and others were fighting against during the Confederacy and during the Civil War was still going on even decades in the future. So, in terms of the production of the film, it was directed by Gary Ross, who was first pitched the idea to make a film about the Jones County Rebellion while at Universal Studios. Gary Ross is a renowned director, having made films such as like Seabiscuit and The Hunger Games. So, he's a pretty credible person to have kind of taken on something like this. And so, thus, he spent several years researching the event so that he could portray it as accurately as possible. And part of this was that once filming actually began, actual Jones County residents were recruited to be most of the extras in the film. And Ross would speak to these residents and kind of get their passed down generational family stories to add to the authenticity of the film, since many of them had been the descendants of actual rebellion members and they had stories told in their family history about their ancestors' parts in this rebellion. Matthew McConaughey ended up being casted as Knight, and Ross claims that this was due to his connection to the South, having been born there, as well as his overall artistry as an actor. And McConaughey took this role really seriously to get into character. He would sleep on set along with other cast and crew. And just to overall contribute to the historical accuracy of this film, Ross made sure that majority of the filming took place in actual Jones County and in surrounding areas. So, in terms of the film portrayal of the war, it does make the mark in a lot of cases, and it does do a good job of keeping things fairly accurate. In terms of the portrayal of the actual Jones County revolt, the film does a really good job in touching on the different reasonings for why each of the rebellion members were there, why they would take part in this. It really shows how the rebellion was carried out in terms of where they would go, how they would acquire weapons, how they'd like set fire to buildings, kind of try to make negotiations with like the Confederate soldiers planted around the area. So the film does a pretty good job of showing what the rebellion would have actually looked like. In terms of battle scenes, there's only really one big Civil War surrounded battle scene in the film, and it's at the very beginning where Knight's nephew is killed. This is, in comparison to other Civil War films, I think that this one's fairly accurate in its portrayal of battle. There's people getting their heads blown off, there's people getting limbs amputated without proper medicine, there's just like so much gore and it's in your face and it doesn't try to skew what the war was actually like to the viewer. So I do believe the battle scene was fairly accurate, and it's the reason why the film has an R rating. In terms of a representation of Southern attitudes, I think Ross does a really good job of showing the anti slavery versus pro slavery rhetoric. There's one defining scene where a white man who joined the rebellion, he's a farmer, he's arguing with Knight about, oh, I don't want to work with these fugitive slaves. Like, why are we helping them? Kind of referring to them as this other. And Newt basically holds a gun up to his face and is like, if you're not with all of us, then you're not with us at all. So the film does keep it realistic by showing not everybody was on the exact same page in this rebellion and that there were differing opinions about emancipation and other subjects like that in the South. And lastly, the way that the life of an outlaw deserter is portrayed is done really well by Ross. It kind of shows you the harsh reality and the risks that it would take for a soldier in the Civil War to have deserted their post and be labeled as a deserter. It wasn't something done lightly. Newt was living in like these swamps. He couldn't go back to his family because he'd be putting them at risk. Some men, if they were caught, were even killed for betraying the cause. So the film really kind of helps viewers understand how big of a deal it was for a soldier to actually make this decision to desert their post. It wasn't something taken lightly. So, in terms of what the film ignores or obscures, I think the main point is how rare it was for an event like this to actually happen during the war. The film kind of makes it seem as though any other town or any other county could have done something like this, but honestly, that's just not quite true. There was a lot of factors involved in ensuring that the Jones County Rebellion actually happened. And so the fact that the film kind of makes it seem like a casual thing that other southern states could have really taken part in, I think was not a great move on Gary Ross's part. The film also doesn't really touch on the overall concept of Southern fatigue in terms of the hardships that civilians in the South faced as a consequence of the war. It doesn't really talk about the sacrifices that these civilians in the South would have to make in comparison to ones in the North in terms of having to give away their goods, their property, sacrificing their sons and brothers and fathers and grandfathers, uncles, like it was a lot. The war took a lot out of people, and the film kind of takes away from that by only focusing on Knight's struggles. Like, I know he's the main character, but I feel like a lot more could have been done in that area. And that ties into the more common ways that Southerners would rebel against the war efforts. There were more below the belt ways instead of outright rebellions that Southerners would try and kind of sidestep the war effort, such as like withdrawing support by like maybe withholding goods and abandoning the cause in terms of people just like outright leaving their property in the South or people deserting the army. So it's not like people didn't find a way to fight back if they didn't cause an outright rebellion, but it just wasn't realistic for everybody to really take up arms and physically fight back. And lastly, something that really bothered me was this film's portrayal of a white savior narrative. And ironically, Gary Ross himself said that he didn't want the film to come across this way. And I think he kind of really shot himself in the foot in that aspect because The film very much poses Newt as this savior to the fugitive slaves by marrying a black woman and standing up against the Confederacy. And like, it's partially due in fact that he is the main character of the story, so you are going to have most of the focus put on him. But I feel like Ross could have done a better job of giving the spotlight to some of the black characters in this film, such as Rachel or some of Newt's friends that he made from this fugitive slave group, which he truly did have in real life. I feel like that would have helped to kind of decrease this air of it being a white savior narrative film. And you can see that in reviews of the film on like Rotten Tomatoes and stuff. Other people also got those vibes. So I feel like that kind of takes away from the good that the film really does do. But in conclusion, I do think that overall, Free State of Jones is a fairly accurate Civil War film, and I do think it does a pretty good job of giving the context and true information into the actual Jones County Rebellion. Whenever you do research about it, the film does pretty much hit all the marks in that case. But there are a few things that the film could have done better at. But it is a good movie, and if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you do so. Thank you.